The madman is not the man who has lost his reason. The madman is the man who has lost everything except his reason. The madman's explanation of a thing is altogether complete and often, in a purely rational sense, satisfactory. Do you know who wrote these lines? The late Victorian early modern writer G.K. Chesterton. And I am back with him today after a gap of a pretty long time. G.K. Chesterton would never depend on the dumb certainties of experience or on preconceived notions to explain a concept. He had his own way of looking at things and putting forward an exposition of his keen insight in a lucid style. Born of parents who believed in the creed of liberalism, G.K. Chesterton was spared from going to a boarding school at an early age. And the freedom and happiness of his younger days not only helped to develop his distinct personality, but also kept the child in him alive in his later years. George MacDonald's The Princess and the Goblin, this was the name of the book, was one of his favorite books, and as a child, Chesterton sincerely believed that there would be goblins hiding in the cellar of their house. It is important to note that later in his life, he commented that fairy stories are spiritual explorations and hence most lifelike, since they reveal human life as seen or felt or divined from inside. Chesterton also believed that fairy tales have a certain curative power because they introduce children to the existential mysteries of life and invariably revolve round a quest motive and a struggle against odds before the final victory is achieved against evil forces. In other words, these stories teach the all-important lesson that nature is not innately good and that life is harsh before it can be happy. To young Gilbert, therefore, these tales almost took the place of Christianity. And hence it is that in Heretics, that's the name of the book, Chesterton later came to write, I quote, "When we step into the family by the act of being born, we do step into a world which is incalculable, into a world which has its own strange laws, into a world which could do without us, into a world we have not made." In other words, when we step into the family, we step into a fairy tale. In his own life, Chesterton always stood up for what he believed. And he was one of the few journalists of his time to oppose British jingoism over Boer War. The so-called progressive ideas of his age were also often the target of his criticism. In his essay Eugenics and Other Evils, published in 1922, he reacted strongly against the popular idea that man should breed a superior version of himself. Neither was Chesterton much impressed by the scientific achievements of his age. As he once wrote, "The materialism is on the face of things. It does not require any science to find it out." He vehemently opposed the theory of scientific determinism that negates the principle of free will and places prime importance on factors like environment and heredity that are beyond human control. I regret that I cannot do my duty as a true modern by cursing everybody who made me what I am. I'm not clear about what that is, but I'm pretty sure that most of it is my fault. He also explained why good comic operas had become so rare in his days. We have no good comic operas of late, because the real world has been more comic than any possible opera. Never a believer in the ideas of progress, Chesterton further argued that men invent new ideals because they dare not attempt old ideals. They look forward with enthusiasm because they are afraid to look back. The modern world was typified by Chesterton as a crowd of very rapid racing cars, all brought to a standstill and stuck in a block of traffic. There was no want of wonder in Chesterton, for he discovered nonsense in the world of common sense. By wondering at things that had been taken for granted by the sensible, where a giant would have made molehills out of mountains, he was a self-confessed pygmy who made mountains out of molehills, and thus used the sacred spectacles of exaggeration. However, the ultimate aim of nonsense is not merely to invert, subvert, or distort and thereby to create confusion. Nonsense seeks to discover or to define an inner harmony that survives on neither common sense nor nonsense, but rather on the distilled essence of sense. And this is precisely what Chesterton does in these essays. He gives us an idea of what he thinks should be and should be not the way to run things in society. He pinpoints the ridiculous in those very elements that are considered to be serious by society, the incoherent in those known for their coherence. Now, what essays am I referring to? I am referring to his collection called The Tremendous Trifles. I'll just take up a few from this collection, and I'll just maybe quote a few sections and try to explain his way of handling things. Okay. The do's and don'ts of an ideal lifestyle are discussed in the closing lines of the essay On Lying in Bed. On lying in bed. I quote from this essay. A man's minor actions and arrangements ought to be free, flexible, creative. The things that should be unchangeable are his principles, his ideals. But with us, the reverse is true. Our views change constantly, but our lunch does not change. Now, I should like men have strong and rooted conceptions. Okay? So I should like men to have strong rooted conceptions, but as for their lunch, let them have it sometimes in the garden, sometimes in bed, sometimes on the roof, sometimes in the top of a tree. So please keep changing the locales of your lunch, but please stick to your rooted conceptions. That is what he wants to tell his readers. So I now come to another essay, or rather let me just talk about his autobiography a bit. Chesterton, in his autobiography, this is really interesting, is however equally critical of men who are too rigid to replace sheep with kangaroos in a mathematical equation based on a rooted conception. What do I mean by this? Let me read out this section from his autobiography. If you say that 2 sheep added to 2 sheep make 4 sheep, your audience will accept it patiently, like sheep. But if you say it of 2 monkeys or 2 kangaroos or 2 sea griffins, people will refuse to believe that 2 and 2 make 4. They seem to imagine that you have made up the arithmetic just as you have made up the illustration of the arithmetic. This is from his autobiography. The essayist concludes by relating all his observations with the pivotal issue of lying in bed. So I come back to lying in bed. I was just trying to tell you that just as he is criticizing people who are absolutely not having strong views, people who keep changing their views constantly, he also believes that excess rigidity of conceptions can be a source of trouble. So somewhere I think he is trying to strike a balance. Coming back to that essay, Lying in Bed, let us see how he concludes it. If you do lie in bed, be sure you do it without any reason or justification at all. I do not speak, of course, of the seriously sick. But if a healthy man lies in bed, let him do it without a rag of excuse. Then he will get up a healthy man. If he does it for some secondary hygienic reason, if he has some scientific explanation, he may get up a hypochondriac. Chesterton discovers topsy-turvy land, unlike Carroll, not in a wonderland that lies underground, but rather in the prosaic Fleet Street of London. An insignificant, to many but certainly not to Chesterton, poster of a vivid violet. It was a poster of vivid violet. It was in violet color, on which he read, written in large black letters, the remarkable words, "Should shop assistants marry? Should shop assistants marry?" Now, this particular poster flags off in his mind a mental journey of thoughts which lead him to an interesting discovery. So these thoughts lead him to an interesting discovery. I'm reading out I'll just read out, or I'll just take you on that journey of thoughts that really came to his mind on seeing this poster. I say that there are many such questions asked. But if the world runs short of them, I can suggest a large number of questions of precisely the same kind based on precisely the same principle. Do feet improve boots? Is bread better when eaten? Should hats have heads in them? Do people spoil a town? Do walls ruin wallpapers? Should neckties enclose necks? Do hands hurt walking sticks? Does burning destroy firewood? Is cleanliness good for soap? Can cricket really improve cricket bats? Shall we take brides with our wedding rings? And 100 others. Not one of these questions differs at all in intellectual purport or in intellectual value from the question which I quoted from the purple poster, or from any of the typical questions asked by half of the earnest economists of our times. All questions they ask are of this character. They are all tinged with the same initial absurdity. They do not ask if the means is suited to the end. They all ask with profound and penetrating skepticism if the end is suited to the means. Quoted from Tremendous Trifles. Okay. On the other level, Chesterton's essay, The Dragon's Grandmother, now I come to this one, reflects upon the nonsensicality of what is conventionally accepted as sensible in fictional writing, in a discussion of the essential difference between folklore and a modern realistic novel. I read out from this essay. Folklore means that the soul is sane, but that the universe is wild and full of marvels. Realism means that the world is dull and full of routine, but that the soul is sick and screaming. In the fairy tales, the cosmos goes mad, but the hero does not go mad. In the modern novels, the hero is mad before the book begins and suffers from harsh steadiness and cruel sanity of the cosmos. It is Chesterton's argument here that the world of common sense, characterized by stagnancy and a brutal sanity, cannot brook resistance, and therefore it puts down rebellions of all kinds. This world, however, is in reality far less sensible than the so-called nonsensical world of a fairy tale with its green sun, blue moon, two-headed giants, and a six-legged horse, where a man can have his way and can assert his free will. However, regrettably, the man who dares to follow his own way in the world of common sense is branded as insane, while on the contrary, in the insane world of fairy tale, a man is allowed to preserve his natural self, and therefore there arises no question of rebellion. The realistic modern novel, according to Chesterton, reflects the state of man in the modern society ruled by the prescriptive norms of common sense, sanity and insanity. On the other hand, a fairy tale depicts a world of fantasy, as perhaps the world should or could be, intruded upon by a really sensible man, a scenario of meaning in which sense obviously does not mean common sense, but something akin to what is commonly assumed to be nonsense. To turn to specific instances, Chesterton's nonsensical reflections in his verse, I would begin with this poem called On the Disastrous Spread of aestheticism in all classes. Now, this was obviously aimed at ridiculing the basic confusion of the aesthetic mode as professed by the pre-Raphaelites or the Wildean, Oscar Wilde, Wildean aesthetes of the day. The poet's passion in this poem for stern art leads him to draw Gladstone's nose on scraps of blotting paper, or to play one-finger tunes upon my aunt's piano. And then the poet describes his funny dream that had shown him the terrifying consequences of the entire world becoming artistic. Let's read this poem. The sea had nothing but a mood of vague, ironic gloom, with which to explain its presence in my upstairs drawing room. The son had read a little book that struck him with a notion. He drowned himself and all his fires deep in the hissing ocean. Then all was dark, lawless and lost. I heard great devilish wings. I knew that art had won and snapped the covenant of things. I cried aloud and I awoke new labors in my head. I set my teeth and manfully began to lie in bed. Toiling, rejoicing, sorrowing, so I my life conduct. Each morning, see some task begun, each evening, see it chucked. But still, in sudden moods of dusk, I hear those great weird wings, feel vaguely thankful to the vast stupidity of things. The name of the collection is Greybeards at Play. And the poem, once again, let me tell you the title of this poem. Let me mention the title of the poem, On the Disastrous Spread of Aestheticism in All Classes. So it is the chaotic lawlessness promoted by aestheticism that is unacceptable to Chesterton. And one is reminded of his earlier rejection of the concept of absolute anarchy in his novel, The Man Who Was Thirsty. We can take this up in some other session. It will be well to make the point in this context that while Chesterton does advocate the use of nonsense to protest against the routine rigors of the world of common sense, his vision of an acceptable social setup is always conjured by an idea of balance and an avoidance of absolutes. In the quoted lines, for example, the mention of Gladstone's nose more than gives the composition a specific contemporary relevance, for it is an instance of an absolute example held up as ridiculous. Chesterton also maintains a stand against aestheticism in his essay, A Defense of Nonsense, where he writes, "Nothing sublimely artistic has ever arisen out of mere art. There must always be a rich moral soil for any great aesthetic growth." That by moral soil, Chesterton meant not religious dogmatism, but a wide-ranging social commitment may be clearly seen in Chesterton's poem, Dangers Attending Altruism on the High Seas. The altruism referred to in the title of this poem is ironically projected in the pity shown by a bold and gay pirate on a little fish floating on the sea on a rainy day. The pirate's knowledge of science tells him that he, the fish, will be wet if he remains much longer in the sea. The fish is thus provided with a rug and ale after it is fished out of water. It is further given a special treat of hard baked beef and beer, and finally it is asked the neatest riddles, but the fish coughed and blushed a pallid green. The fish being thus bereft of appreciation, the pirate and his companions court-martial it for its lack of social sympathy and decide to throw it back in the sea. The poem illustrates the terrifying consequences of excessive altruism and shows how the imposition of inappropriate social codes can have almost disastrous consequences. Yet the poem's tone is optimistic in the sense that it ends with the victory of the individual and is a lesson to the social animal that a fish, the social animal here obviously is man, it's a lesson to man that a fish can afford to be wet and be different from other created beings. Less overtly nonsensical is Chesterton's most famous poem, The Donkey, which was included in his second collection entitled The Wild Knight. I read out this poem. When fishes flew and forests walked, and figs grew upon thorn, some moment when the moon was blood, then surely I was born. With monstrous head and sickening cry, and ears like errant wings, the devil's walking parody on all four-footed things, the tattered outlaw of the earth, of ancient crooked will, starve, scourge, deride me, I'm dumb, I keep my secrets still. Fools, for I also had my hour, once far fierce hour, one far fierce hour and sweet. There was a shout about my ears and palms before my feet. Dale Alquist considers this poem to be the microcosm of Chesterton's philosophy. I quote, "Already present in this sweet little poem are all the elements that would fill his writing for the rest of his life. Paradox, humor, humility, wonder, the defense of the poor and the simple, the rebuke of the rich, worldly and wise. Certainly, the donkey is a nonsensical creation of a chaotic universe, and it perhaps is the wisest fool who can laugh at the foolish wise. It is an outlaw who rebels through its silence, and it deliberately maintains, this silence is deliberately maintained by the donkey to preserve its secrecy." So now it's time for us to round up. And as we sum up, we can only say, Chesterton was a man who set himself up against the so-called normalities and probities of his contemporary society. In many ways, his was a conservative vision, but his tastes and inclinations were always different, even carnivalesque. And it is in this that Chesterton is a flag bearer in the cause of nonsense. Hugh Kenner describes Chesterton as a sturdy realist. He says, his favorite logical device was the reduction ad absurdum, because that line of argument springs most readily with the least possible degree of abstractness from a direct metaphysical perception. When you see something absurd, you are in touch with reality. Unquote. Chesterton was far from being an anarchist and used nonsense to oppose the commonsensical, orderly social existence plagued with innumerable maladies, and also to reveal the distilled essence of sense, which is essentially related to harmony. While the works of Lear and Carroll primarily limit themselves to the personal lives of their creators and take us to fantasy worlds of mock turtles, griffons, jumbly girls, and Humpty Dumptys, Chesterton successfully relates nonsense with his times and deliberately sticks to a far more impersonal approach. Nonsense figures as Jabberwocks, Snarks, and Dongs are conspicuously absent in his works, and he strictly limits his pen to the English scene. I hope my viewers have enjoyed this session. See you soon.